All right.
Okay.
Here we are.
Good morning. This is Bibles, Bagels,
and Francis.
with the
Please,
Beals.
can you get
and,
in? Thank you.
and our
this
dog.
Is perfect.
We are
exactly
so
what we were hoping
live.
would happen.
It's fine. We're live, and our dog and Seth are going downstairs. Bibles, Bagels, and the Beals. So we are here for an experiment for a 3-week series on basically the Psalms in a time of pandemic, right?
Yeah.
And so we're going to work through some Psalms. Tim will introduce the work that we're going to do. But we want to say hi to everyone around the country, because I know Forest Hill Church people are watching, and Mountview people are watching, and I think some others are watching who've been invited. So we have over 80 people on this study. So this is kind of fun and weird, and great. So first I want to start by giving honor to Dr. Patrick Miller, who is a professor of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible at Princeton Theological Seminary, and he did work on the Psalms and was a respected scholar and theologian and good man, and he died yesterday, the 1st, and so we want to honor Patrick Miller.
Absolutely. Our friend and my colleague Todd Linnefeld and I, when we published a book in honor of Walter Brueggemann, Pat Miller was absolutely essential to that whole process. So we got to know him better during that time, and he was a huge fan of Walter's work, which we'll be relying on heavily today. A great scholar, a great teacher at Princeton Theological Seminary for many, many years, and I know a lot of people are grieving his loss, and we'll miss him a great deal.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. One of the reasons that we have chosen the Psalms and the work with the Psalms for the next 3 weeks, we've thought a lot about grief, and we hear a lot about grief during this time of pandemic, or more has been is being written and talked about, and it strikes me that a lot of it is being done from a psychological perspective, importantly, a sociological perspective. But what we have to offer, what religious communities have to offer, is language and metaphor and story and ways of thinking about grief and ritual to manage grief, to honor grief. And so we are offering the Psalms as a place of richness to help us do that.
That's right.
Yes?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right, we're going to explore the text. And now I get to turn it over to Tim Beal, who is a professor of religion and Hebrew Bible at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and my spouse. And we live in this space, and we both studied at Columbia Theological Seminary. So shout out to those who I know are Columbia grads.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so I think we should start with just some general framing, and some very basic general stuff about the Psalms, and then a kind of way of looking at the Psalms that we think could be really helpful and valuable during this particular time. So just in general, you know, the book of Psalms in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's a collection of 150 poems. These poems started out in their earliest contexts in ritual settings. They were part of ancient Israel's and ancient Judah's religious life, ritual life. These are poems, and the poems in the Hebrew Scriptures, were certainly canted or sung as part of worship. These weren't things that someone had by their bedside that they'd read by themselves at night or something like that. It was a communal ritual context in which they first circulated, and some of them are individual and some of them are collective. That is, some speak from an I and some speak from a we perspective. Over time, these psalms were collected together into, different kinds of collections. And it's a complicated process, and not anybody really knows exactly how they all ended up in the Bible. But you can imagine that they started in an oral worship setting, ritual setting, and then were collected, written down, and eventually ended up edited together in our Book of Psalms, which has 150 of them. There probably were a lot of other ones that didn't make it into our Bible, but that's what they are. They represent a huge range of experience and emotion and theology, ideas about God and history and identity and community and suffering. One way to think about a lot of them that can be a really helpful way of looking at the Psalms is a kind of schema, a taxonomy maybe, that Walter Brueggemann developed early on in his career, and that is to think of them, some of them are psalms of orientation, some of them are psalms of disorientation, and some of them are psalms of new orientation. And he developed that and modified that from some work by the philosopher Paul Ricoeur on orientation, disorientation, orientation, reorientation. But for Walter, it was important to say new orientation. So I just want to talk briefly through what each of those generally means, but I think they kind of make fairly obvious sense too. So psalms of orientation, whether spoken in the first person I, singular, or in the first person plural we, these are psalms that express a sense of confidence in the order of things, the order of creation. God is on the throne in the heaven, and we are all where we should be, and everything makes sense and fits together into a meaningful whole. Oftentimes they give expression to this idea of a kind of moral universe where, good deeds get rewarded and bad deeds get punished, and the righteous prosper and the wicked get what they deserve in the end. All of that kind of thing. The idea that all of creation just is all kind of fits together in this perfect ecology, and everything in its right place, as the Radiohead song goes. And so that's the sense of orientation. A lot of times we call these hymns of orientation, hymns on creation, for example.
May I add to the Psalms of Orientation?
Yeah.
I have some things to add. And I just want to say hi to people who are just coming on, because I know some people have lost the first 5 minutes. So we're doing Psalms of Orientation, Disorientation, and New Orientation, just so a reminder here. Tim was talking about that these are the Psalms of order, that they sing kind of the Psalms of order, and I was thinking to add some of the words to that life, that Psalms of Orientation are that time of life when things seem predictable and stable. Walter Brueggemann talks about it, the Psalms of Orientation providing a sacred canopy, a framework where we hold the experiences of stability in our lives, and this message of the world is fine and predictable. If you do the right things, you're blessed. This transactional look. And I think about right now in our time, and some of our leaders, our president, who often uses the word, things are perfect, things are beautiful, things couldn't be better. And each of us, it doesn't feel right because things don't feel better, but the message from the powers that be, often in orientation, those who have power, is the message is to tell others that things are fine. That's the message, and you keep the power.
Right. And that's and when that happens, we're going to talk in a second about the second kind of psalms of disorientation. When you're in that place of disorientation and something like that orientation is asserted in such a forceful way, it can be very alienating. The experience of orientation from one person, if you're not there, feels very disjunctive, and that sacred canopy has torn and no longer is working for you. So that's what Psalms of Disorientation are about. They give expression to an experience that comes about through some kind of crisis in orientation, some sort of undermining where the kind of ground has fallen out from under you, where something has happened that doesn't make sense according to that order that you believed in. And they are often very raw. We're going to look at an example of each one in just a couple minutes, but they're often very raw. They often speak from bodily experience of physical suffering, of mental suffering, and so on like that. So a kind of a personal or collective chaos that has interrupted that order of orientation. And when you're in that place of disorientation, suddenly all of that rhetoric about order and everything is in its right place and everything makes sense just crumbles and falls to the ground, makes no sense at all. And so it's important, and that's kind of, I think, what a lot of people are feeling right now.
Yeah, disorientation, especially experiences of disorientation. Make sure we're getting sound. Okay, that the sound is working.
Yeah,
okay.
Somebody would.
Okay, I can't get sound.
I don't know.
The picture. Okay, we're just trusting that's true.
Yeah.
That I think that this period in this pandemic, especially because it felt like it came out of nowhere. That we were going along, we're making plans, vacations were coming, weddings were planned, all of life seemed normal, and then this pandemic came, and the leader said, shelter in place, and everything, shut down, and this experience of dislocation, that we no longer knew where we were going, that we were located and oriented, and then now we're dislocated and disoriented, and it was like we were picked up and put in a new land, and we don't know which way is north or east, as I understand Orient. So anyway, so that experience, and I just want to say that a time of disorientation, I think we are in this time of disorientation, and I know people who are experiencing disorientation in their personal lives right now. So it's not just the pandemic. There are illnesses and loss, diagnoses, divorces, things going on that at a personal level also have disoriented people.
Absolutely.
Almost double disorientation at this very, very strange time.
Right. Absolutely. I think the sound is working. People are saying so. That's great.
Good.
So, I got a little distracted about that for a second.
Disorientation.
Just slightly disoriented.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you hear what I said?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I did.
Good.
Well, I was thinking because I'd heard someone talking about having lost someone. Her father died during this time, and there was a moment, a couple of days, where it almost sort of felt like the whole world was grieving with her, that because of the coincidence of the disorientation. But at a certain point, actually, that kind of started to work against her. She felt like she needed to be in disorientation and have others who were not in as much disorientation there to be able to sort of hold her in that disorientation. And so that it became this weird, echoing disorientations that are not the same thing and not resonating with one another, which was an interesting, I wondered about.
It's so destabilizing to have all of us or most of us feeling disoriented. My friend Liz says it puts you on your left foot where you're destabilized, you don't feel strong, and then when other people don't feel stabilized, it's even more disorienting. So there is a sense where you want some people in orientation, kind of a framework of care, of stability.
Yeah, exactly. So that's orientation, disorientation. Kind of think of it as a going down, hitting rock bottom in some way. And then there's new orientation. Psalms of new orientation are not the same as it's not a reorientation. It's a new orientation because what we're talking about is someone who has come out of that disorientation, who has emerged from it in a new way, and they've been changed by the pain, by the grief, by the loss, whatever it is. But they had some kind of an experience of an answer, of an insight, of a moment that helped lift them out of that into a new sense of orientation. That new orientation, as Ian and Clover preached on Easter Sunday, is not the same as the old orientation. It's something new. And in fact, you don't know what that new orientation might be when you're in the disorientation.
Okay.
Hey, we're back. Sorry, I don't know what happened, but we use a lot of broadband bandwidth in this house. So
thanks for your patience.
Yeah, thank you.
Repeat what you just said.
So Amanda Osenga, our associate pastor for youth, just texted and said, you heard me say, so we go from order to chaos, and then we go to something new. We go to some kind of emergent new order that's not the old order, but we can't know what it is while we're in that disorientation, while we're in that chaos. It kind of relates to what we call chaos theory, which is this notion that new forms of life, new kinds of order emerge out of chaos, but they emerge in a kind of nonlinear way that you really can't predict. Back to predicting again. So that is the basic sort of frame for understanding the Psalms. Orientation, disorientation, new orientation. Now there's a biblical...
May I say something about new orientation?
Yep.
Okay, new orientation also, as Tim said, I think it's the surprise of not knowing when that moment of pivot happens. It's kind of a mystery. You can't control it. It goes from that, as you said, uncertainty to... It's not certainty, but it's this new understanding or some sort of transformation, like the clouds kind of part and you see life in a new way or a different way. There's a return of energy, possibility, but the mourning is turned into the sadness and mourning is turned into joy. Not happiness, but joy. So something has changed. And it's new. It doesn't return. I just wanted to repeat that.
Yeah, and it's not naive.
No,
it's not naive about pain and suffering. It's marked by the disorientation, marked by the pain, marked by the suffering in a way that makes it differently real.
And may I add, because we're in this, because it's a conversation.
Yeah.
Because we're in this time where we just went. We were in ordinary time, the church seasons, ordinary time. And then we moved into Lent, and that's the time we enter into disorientation and reflection and intentionally. And then we moved to the drama of Holy Week and crucifixion, the pain of the story of disorientation for Jesus and the disciples. And then we sit in that Holy Saturday, which is combined with the crucifixion, that we sit in this not understanding. Right. And then the resurrection comes and it's the new life and the new orientation, and then, as you're just saying, the integration of the pain. And Jesus still has the scars, right? He's not perfect after the resurrection, that there's still, we bear the suffering in new orientation.
Right. Good. And that's a great segue, because I wanted to say a little bit about in the rest of the Hebrew biblical narrative, the way this kind of orientation, disorientation, new orientation is reflected in and resonates with the biblical narrative. And the narrative behind the crucifixion resurrection story is the narrative of the Exodus, right? All of those things happen around Passover, and Passover is a remembering of the Exodus narrative. And I just want to read a text that really, I think, resonates with this pattern, and especially with the power of the voice of disorientation. I think biblical literature privileges the voice of pain, privileges the voice of disorientation and chaos in a way that I think is rather unique and especially powerful for us as a community. There is this notion that the voice of pain and suffering, the voice coming out of that embodied pain and suffering, actually has the power to move God to respond. That God might actually forget us and need to be reminded of us through our pain and suffering. And so
cry out.
Exactly. So this text in Exodus 2 at the end of chapter 2 is just a tiny little narrative version of that, but it's very powerful. It's after the Israelite people have fallen into slavery in Egypt, and it's the moment where the cry comes to God. And it says in these three verses, 23, 24, 25, after a long time the king of Egypt died, the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. I love that the cry is an actor in this story, that the cry rises up. God heard their groaning. God remembered remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. So the cry actually moves God to respond. And that's really a critical kind of theological underpinning of these Psalms of disorientation. And then there's another brief text that's related to this. This is in Deuteronomy 26. There are several stories like this where when the Israelites are to remember their to remember their own story, the way they remember it is in this same shape, where they went into slavery, they cried out from slavery, God heard, and God remembered. And so this is a ritual that someone during a harvest season would recite. And it says, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. That's Abraham and Sarah. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly, even though this is generations later, and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction. The Lord brought us out with a strong hand, and so on. So there it is again, the cry out of disorientation, the hearing and the acting and the delivering. And that is that same narrative shape. So I think, again, I think it's just remarkable that theological notion that the voice of pain moves God in a way that God might not otherwise be moved. On the one hand, it's a weird idea of God, I think, for a lot of us. On the other hand, it gives such power to our own raw experience of disorientation and pain.
Right, and I feel that the agency, the call to agency, that we are not passive actors in God's story, or we have no will, no relationship. It calls us into relationship and honesty, a relationship of rawness and honesty, and inviting God to remember, that we remember the story as a collective, and we're asking God to remember God's covenant to us. It's really bold, and we don't think this way. We don't think as Calvinists. I don't know. Is that a Calvin thing?
Not really.
Not really. Well, right. I mean, but as Calvinists, we tend to be, God is sovereign, and we give over to the will of God, and who are we to ask, and your will be done. But in this kind of text, in these Psalms, and I think the Hebrew Scriptures are much more inviting of our agency and relationship with God to cry out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we are invited in our pain to cry out, not just to receive it and be submissive to it.
And even be so bold as to expect to
God
be heard
to
in
act.
that.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Right.
Not to be told we're wrong, or we're not looking at it the right way, or it only feels like God's not there, or whatever.
And it's both the personal and the collective. Like you said, it's us. It's our story. And I think about communities of communities that have been oppressed. The African American community, the story of the generation is the story of pain. Is the story even of many African Americans today. They claim the story of slavery as their people's story. And I think others of us who have been privileged think more personally and individually, and we don't have a collective kind of consciousness.
Right.
Is that okay to say?
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
I think that's true.
I think so. And Western Protestant Christianity has really oriented itself toward individual piety and individual experience and salvation and so forth. So that's the frame. Orientation, disorientation, new orientation. Sorry.
Yep, that's all right.
And we thought we would just look briefly at 3 Psalms that are one example of each. Are you going to say something?
I'm going to say, if you have your Bible, which you should, first your Bible, turn to Psalm 8. That's what we're looking at, right? Psalm 8. We want you to follow with us. So we expect, and if you don't have it this time, have it next time. And if you don't have a Bible, you can look on your phone, Oremus Bible. Anyway, there are Bibles on phones, and so make sure you're looking at the text with us. We really want that.
So this is a psalm of orientation, and I'll read it, and then you maybe say a little bit what you think about it.
Or I can read it.
Sure, if you'd like to. I have it right here.
Oh, you have it right there. I have a nice little psalm. Okay, let me read it, and then you can say some things.
Okay.
Psalm 8. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are the human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than God, and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
Thank you. So if we had more time, we could really get deep into this. But just briefly, you have this language of power and glory, bulwark against your enemies, silencing the enemies and the avengers. And then it moves into language that is very reminiscent of Genesis 1, the first creation story, where the human, everything is ordered and symmetrical and so forth, and humans are created last as a kind of culmination of creation, and they're created in God's image, and they're given dominion, and all of that, and the language about the heavens is all there. All of it sort of asserting that everything makes sense. The whole order of creation makes sense, and God at the top of it and the creator of it is the sort of guarantor of that order. Right.
All these images of bulwark, these are the stable and strong and powerful and blessing and dominion. As you said, they very much locate us just a little lower than the gods.
And you'll find other psalms of orientation that are more focused on, following the law, and if you follow the Torah, you'll be blessed, and your family will be blessed, and everything around you will be blessed through you, and so on. But that one was more of a creation-oriented So now we are going to look at a Psalm of Disorientation. Do you want me to read this one? Or?
Sure. It's a little long.
Yeah, we'll
Psalm,
go.
Yeah, make sure they have time to.
So it's Psalm 88, and you can just listen. I mean, next time we're gonna, if you don't have a Bible with you right now, next time we'll get into it in more detail, and you'll definitely want to be able to look at it. But this is in my mind, the most raw, unrelentingly disoriented psalm in the Bible. It's almost amazing to me that it made it into the Bible. And I will just read it. It's fairly long, so I'll read it fairly quickly, and then you can say a little bit about it. O Lord, God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol, the pit, the grave. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like a slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a thing of horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eye grows dim through sorrow. Every day I call on you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon, another word for death? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your saving help in the land of forgetfulness? But I, O Lord, cry out to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Wretched and close to death from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am desperate. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dread assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. From all sides they close in on me. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. My companions are in darkness.
There is no resolution.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. And then we preach on that.
Well, it's interesting that it's not an electionary. You know, a lot of the really raw stuff in the Bible doesn't make it to the into the pulpit.
It's so unusual. We are not encouraged to speak to God like that, or if we do, there's it's resolved at the end. But you are great. Don't get me wrong. And this one, I think my colleague preached on 88 when we did a series on the Psalms, I believe, and it was, I thought, one of his best, because at the end of it, because it ends so abruptly, he talked about what else would God do but be silent, because what you do when someone is in pain is you don't give answers, you respect, and you sit in silence. So there's a sense of, where is God? This one in pain is railing and lamenting, and God is respectfully silent, or not at all. I mean, right, you said, maybe God isn't there. That experience of that person in pain is that God doesn't show up in the text, and so you can't talk someone out of that. It's not the time to do theology for someone in pain.
And maybe it's even the time for us who might not be feeling that way to actually take in that reality of divine absence and abandonment, that experience, to let that voice of pain shake our own theology and our own comfort.
We are not given over to that. That is not something we feel comfortable doing, is just don't rescue God. Don't rescue the person in pain. Let them sit with it. And more importantly, how does it shape us and change us? But boy, we are so defended from being changed or transformed. We want to move quickly. We want to resolve it. We want to, as in this pandemic, get back to normal or go back to normal. But there's no going back.
There's a famous quote from a philosopher, Theodor Adorno: "To let suffering speak is the condition of all truth."
Say that again that way.
To let suffering speak is the condition of all truth. That letting that voice of pain break through. If your truth isn't true in the face of that pain, then it's not true at all.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So now, moving
Yay.
on to a psalm of new orientation, and I think
We are using the NRSV, just in case you're wondering.
Yeah,
the
new
new
Revised
revised
Standard
standard version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
it's pretty common one. Comes from the standard version, the revised standard version, and then the new revised standard version, a kind of 120-year-old family of translations. Which, by the way, one of the key translators of the RSV was Walter Brueggemann's teacher, James Meilenberg, interestingly.
A very good teacher
tidbit.
from Union Seminary.
So remember that a psalm of new orientation is one from a voice that has been through disorientation and has been at that low point. It has cried out from that and is now in a new place, but remembers the pain and remembers that experience of crying out and being heard. And Psalm 30 is a great example of that because there's praise, but there's also in it an explicit remembering of when the psalmist was in trouble and cried out and asked for deliverance. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to?
I'll read it. Psalm 30. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up and did not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol, restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you, his faithful ones, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you had established me as a strong mountain. You hid your face. I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cried, and to the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, so that my soul may praise you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever.
Thanks. Such beautiful metaphors. I mean, turned mourning into dancing. We all know, we're familiar with that language. Sackcloth into clothing of joy. You've got the orientation to disorientation in a nutshell there in verses 6 and 7. As for me, I said in my prosperity, which is another way of saying orientation, I shall never be moved. This is how it's always going to be. But by your favor, O Lord, you had established me as a strong mountain.
Hold on. People are asking, the psalm we just read, the
30.
new orientation
So
is Psalm 30.
Right.
Just be sure.
Yeah. So, as I was saying, prosperity established by God, I shall not be moved, that sense of orientation. And then it says, you hid your face. I was dismayed. In other words, I suddenly experienced your absence, even as a willful decision to be absent, hiding your face, withdrawing your presence from me. And at that moment, to you, O Lord, I cried, I made supplication, and quotes some of the motivations that the person gave for, delivering her or him from that disorientation. And then there's a turn, and there's a new orientation. But it's a dancing that remembers mourning. It's a clothing of joy that remembers sackcloth and ashes. And that's the new
integration,
orientation.
right? The new orientation integrates the pain, and therapists know that you can't deny and move on as if it never happened, which we want to. Well, we'll just move on, get past it. But the health, the wholeness journey is to integrate pain and become new people, oriented until the next time of disorientation. The cycle of that.
Some of us have, one of those times in our lives, one of those really profound, disorienting times, a sort of experience of exile in some sense, or something that shapes our whole lives. Some of us are in and out of these cycles on a tight. It's not a loop. I shouldn't say on a tighter loop, but you know what I mean. We move back and forth through these all the time.
Right. I like to think about my image is not so much that we circle back around and here we are again, but that there's a spiral, and that it's a spiral downward, that we do orientation, disorientation, new orientation, maybe multiple times in our lives, but the spiral goes deeper and deeper, so that we become deeper people and go closer and closer to the center of ourselves, of our wholeness. It's not static or stagnant, or static, I guess, that we're staying at a surface level of the cycle, but that it keeps going lower and lower. And with every cycle of orientation, disorientation, new orientation, we begin to see it. And there's, I think, a resiliency that happens because we see that we aren't certain when we'll move out of the disorientation, but we trust that something might come, new life will come.
And when we're in disorientation, we don't need to feel like, I know this is going to get better. I'm just moving through the stages of grief or whatever, like in some narrative way. We don't. We just can be present with disorientation, and it is all there is in that moment. It doesn't have to move. It doesn't have to include hope necessarily. Because sometimes that can feel like a dismissal or a denial of the pain when someone says, I know it's terrible, but you'll get through it. Sometimes we need to hear that. But it is what it is. On its own.
Where the transformation. I think about the chrysalis, where the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis and then becomes the butterfly. But that chrysalis is dark and a cocoon, and you don't know what's going to come out of it, and it's in the darkness that the transformation takes place. If we can stay in that chaos or in that exile or in the belly of the whale, whatever the metaphor is for staying put in the suffering, but especially Westerners, we are not used to that. We want, as you said, we want to move on, and how many times in this pandemic I've heard we just need to get back to normal, as if there's this normal orientation, or we will get through this. True, at a cost, and at a cost to some more than others. And most of us, most people I know, are privileged, and so we can say that, and others, the cost is going to be great and is great, is profound. So every time we say we'll get through this, it dismisses some people's disorientation. And like you said earlier, if we can sit with other people's pain, we get changed. If we can allow that to happen, even if it's not just ours, we are changed by someone else's suffering.
Yeah, exactly. I think I was just thinking that some forms of new orientation that come out of this might not be good. We might. There's a lot of talk about how private rights to privacy and other kinds of human rights could be forfeited for the sake of security around pandemics and so forth, whether it's health records or other kinds of data. there's a concern. My colleague Joy Bostick at Case Western Reserve was talking about this, that all of the medical language we're using around, you know, immunity and contagion and infection and clean, it relates to language about clean and unclean and foreign bodies and, you know, and that sort of thing. And that language can contribute to xenophobia in our culture going forward. It can tie into race and sexuality and other things, and nationality and so forth, in all kinds of really dangerous ways, where the biological, the microbiological gets connected with racial, with ethnic, with sexual kinds of language in really dangerous, exclusionary ways.
That's interesting.
So there can be bad new orientations that come out of disorientation, driven by fear rather than trust, love.
I'm struck that that one of the ways that we make meaning out of times of disorientation and times of grief and suffering is to be in community. And I think during this time of pandemic and stay at home and the disorientation, the uncertainty of when we will open up and what that will look like, that it has to be, this conversation has to take place in community, that this isn't a private enterprise. And so we get insights from colleagues, we get insights from texts like scripture and other thinkers. We connect the dots together to make meaning. And so we need each other, and we need conversation partners to do that. And as a pastor, I feel such a responsibility to be lifting up a little higher and looking at what's going on and trying to make sense of what might be happening, discerning where is the Spirit in this, where is God, is God, this isn't caused by God, but suffering is a teacher. So what are we learning about ourselves? What are we cracking open to? Anyway.
Yeah. So we have just about 5 or 8 minutes. Do we want to see if there are any questions in the chat or anything? So I can, while Clover looks at that, or do you want to just look at it on my phone?
If you have questions,
people have been asking.
Oh, they
some,
are?
I think.
Okay, they go fast, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And I know Taylor Anderson is probably laughing at us. If you have a question, if you could repeat it or write it again, and it'll show up in our chat stream feed. I don't know how to see them. We'll learn that before the next one.
They're coming along. Well, I can talk about the translation issue just briefly that came up earlier about what translation we're using, because I think it's relevant when it comes to these
biblical translation.
Yeah, biblical translation. Yeah, that it's relevant when we're talking about these texts that present a kind of an idea or image of God that doesn't feel orthodox, that doesn't feel like what Christians supposedly believe about God. And in cases like Psalm 88, like there has to be some other way to put this, where this is what people are feeling, or this is what the psalmist is feeling, rather than what is actually true. And, translation is very, very powerful in its ability to, in the power that the translator has to soften those things that strike us as problematic, that challenge our own theology or our own comfort level. They can soften that language of pain and suffering that's so raw in Psalm 88. They can make it sound a little different when it says God remembered the covenant after the cries go up and move God to act.
You mean they can choose a different word?
Word it differently, paraphrase it somehow. Oh Lord, I feel like you're not here, in terms of, instead of why have you hidden your face from me? It feels like I'm dead already, or that kind of thing.
Can you say a little bit, because I think there are probably folks who don't, we might be making assumptions. So when Tim means a translator, can you say like exactly what you're talking about from the Hebrew into English,
Sure.
right? Because for some it might
Yeah.
not make
So,
sense.
I mean, there's never a one-to-one correlation between a Hebrew word or a Hebrew phrase that is, the Old Testament comes to us in the Hebrew language. Any translation is always an interpretation. And whenever you're translating, you're changing it in some way. And if the interest of the translator is always shaping the translation. And I just wondered when I was reading that and someone asked about what translation it was, whether it just didn't sound like something that should be in the Bible. And what translation is that?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if you went and read the Living Bible or some of these other much sort of more looser paraphrase type Bibles, if you wouldn't find different language there that again softens the edges that are so rough to us in those texts. So anytime you're translating, you are interpreting, you are shaping the text and the experience of the reader.
Right.
And you can do that. We try to be, faithful to what's there in the text, but our own discomfort, when in Exodus 32 it says God repented of the evil that God had intended to do, we might want to say God repented of the punishment that God was going to do, or something like that, because you can translate these words so many different ways.
And even repent, it's
changed God's mind is often put that way.
Yeah, which is also
right
a hard thing. So one of the questions Natalie asked, so we say that hope, that suffering, how do you say it, that hope might diminish suffering, our understanding or our experience of suffering. So where then does hope come from? And what do we hope for in times of disorientation? It's a great question. I think a lot of people wonder about that. You don't want to give up hope, or I like to use the word trust. I think hope is maybe been bankrupt, maybe in or sentimentalized. I don't know. It doesn't seem to stay. Yeah, it's not positive. It's not a naive, expectation that things will work out. But hope, to me, is a deep trust that we have not been left alone. We have not been abandoned, and maybe that is that God hasn't abandoned us, but or maybe it's a deep trust that the community won't abandon us, that we are not alone. And I don't know. I just think of trust, and that's the hope. The lifeline is that we can cling to the trust that we will move through this, and yet uncertain about what that will look like.
Right. Yeah.
What do you think?
I think I agree, and I was thinking, another sort of schema that Walter Brueggemann uses is reality to grief to hope, over against the empire's ideology to denial to despair. And part of what's core to that is the notion that there's no hope without giving voice to grief, that's a false hope if you haven't allowed the grief to be real.
Yeah.
And so you have to move through hopelessness in some sense and grief in order to experience real hope that's realistic, that's worn the sackcloths, that's been in mourning and now is dancing and wearing clothes of joy. Relatedly, Megan asked, I see, I've heard so many people talking about not having fear or not giving in to fear. What are your thoughts on this? Could this be an attempt to deny the disorientation?
So telling us not to be afraid, right?
Right, yeah. I was thinking about this, in my university context, that sometimes what happens is when we're not really openly acknowledging our fear, it's kind of like not openly acknowledging our grief, then what we do instead is we come up with all these grievances and we complain
Yes,
about the
anger.
administration or we whatever, because but the thing under the thing is the fear.
Yeah.
And fear is real, and it makes no psychological or sociological sense not to acknowledge fear.
Yeah.
Now, using it to fire things up and
Right.
to motivate or to justify
Right.
abuse or violence, that's a completely
Right.
different movement, right?
Yeah, I agree that I think fear, if not genuinely acknowledged, and I think behind the fear is grief, is loss, is maybe a fear that you won't be in power anymore. I think white male privilege, there's under the anger or the acting out is really a fear that they might be losing control. We like to say behind the mad is sad, and I would put sad and fear kind of in the same category. It's anxiety. It's not productive,
Right.
but it is. It is what it is. And if we try to deny it and push it away or tamp it down, it just comes out sideways in destructive ways. So I would say, I think we're afraid. And yet, I think it's the and yet, that pivot. And yet, we don't have to be paralyzed by our fear and anxiety. And if we admit our grief, perhaps it will be the antidote to the fear.
Yeah.
Therapists probably have a much better idea about that, but
That's good.
but I think we're getting at something.
Well,
I think the text gets at something.
Yeah. How could you be in disorientation and not feel fear?
Right.
You're not in control.
Yes.
You're disoriented. That's terrifying.
Yes.
Though there's so much language in the Psalms of Disorientation about terror and horror
Yeah.
and darkness and fear and threat.
Yeah.
It's real.
It is real. And Amy Sanders said that with patience, we are afraid of fear. But when in times of disorientation and fear and anxiety, especially fear, the best really we can do is be still and sit with it. And instead of come up with answers and we have to do things or we can fix it or we're going to blame someone because we have to do something with that energy that we're feeling, and instead of just sitting with it and let it work on us, because the emotions work on us, and so they need to do their work of transformation. And so sitting with it might be the hardest thing, because we are not taught to allow space to have our hearts broken and to sit with the pain. We do everything to numb the pain, to get away from the pain, to be active because we're productive people, addicted to not feeling. Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Well, I think, I was talking about this with a friend of mine, Dick Nodell, who saw that experience of fear and being under siege. The many of us feel the need to act, to find something to do about it, when in fact what we need to do is breathe. And sort of sit back. And he said, instead of looking for something, just sort of try to take on a kind of unfocused gaze for a minute, just to sort of sit with it, which is, I guess, the equivalent of breathing in some ways in terms of mental space. But I think that desire to do something with it, to act on it immediately, is so often the wrong reaction.
Right. We do want to get away from it. And it is hard to sit with it. I think that's when we also sit with it as a community, that we need, and this is what the religious communities can offer, are rituals of acknowledging grief, of sitting together in pain, sitting Shiva, sitting together and reading texts and acknowledging it, that we're not alone in it. because it can work a number. Sitting with it with support, yes, exactly. Sitting in community. I'm reading Shannon's. Some of us probably don't need more time in our heads. That's right. But more time in our heads perseverating on it is maybe different than here in the broken heart. There's a great quote from a rabbi. This will be maybe wrapping it up. There's a great quote about a question of a young student said, Rabbi, why do we have to read the text so much? Why do we have to read the scripture so much? Why do we need to memorize it? And the rabbi said, we have to paint the scripture on our hearts. We paint it on our hearts. And then when we come into times when our hearts are broken, the scripture falls in. And so we learn the text, we read the text, we know the text, paint it on our hearts, and then in times when our hearts are broken, and they will be, the scripture falls in and does its work in transforming us. Some people have asked about a book or somewhere that can talk about Brueggemann's schema of orientation, disorientation, new orientation. And Chin says, check out Brueggemann's book, Spirituality of the Psalms.
That's a good place
it's a
to start.
great place to start. Brueggemann's books on the Psalms, The Message of the Psalms.
The Message of the Psalms is another good one.
It's very good. We've done these books at Montview. Ian and I preached a series on the Psalms during Lent 2 years ago in 2018. We did a study on the message of the Psalms or spirituality of the Psalms. Anything Brueggemann has are great. And we'll keep doing this, and maybe we can post a little bibliography on the group this week, and that'll be good.
Yeah. Well, this worked okay.
I think so.
Yeah. Sorry
Worked
about
for
the
us.
glitch in the middle. Well,
thanks for hanging in, even though we lost it. And Taylor will do better. I know he's laughing.
Taylor, we're like 3 feet from the router, by the way.
Yeah,
told
we're
us to
from
be
the
close
router.
to the router. But so is our son on Xbox Live. So that would be
all right.
Anyway.
Blessings. We love you all. Thank you for tuning in. And next Saturday, Bagels with the Beals.
All right.
All right. Blessings.
Bye.